Most people don't lose power when they're challenged, they lose it when they're seen. The chandelier light flickered softly across the polished marble as the entire dining room shifted without a word because Richard Blackwood had just walked in, and every server suddenly found something else to do, menus to straighten glasses to polish anything but meet his eyes, because everyone knew one wrong move could cost them more than a tip. It could cost them their dignity. He didn't sit, he claimed space like he owned the air around it. His watch caught the light, a quiet reminder that every second in that room could be bought and sold. Then the glass fell, a simple accident, a sharp crack against the floor, and no one moved, not the manager, not the senior staff, not even the busboy. Frozen by an invisible rule, no one touched anything that belonged to him until he said so. Richard didn't look down, he never did. He waited, because this was the part he enjoyed, the silence, the hesitation, the way people revealed themselves when pressure filled the room, and then footsteps, calm, steady, unhurried. Emily Carter, new uniform still crisp, bent down, without asking. Her hands didn't shake, her breath didn't change. She gathered the broken pieces one by one like it was just another part of the job. Sir, she said quietly, without looking up, if you're waiting for someone to be afraid, you might be here. While the words didn't rise, they settled, and somehow that made them heavier. The room held its breath. Richard's eyes narrowed, not angry, not yet, just curious, the kind of curiosity that came before a storm. He leaned back, studying her like a puzzle he hadn't expected to solve. What's your name? He asked, voice smooth, controlled. Emily, she replied, placing the last shard on the tray and standing straight, not defensive, not submissive, just there. He smiled faintly, the kind that usually meant trouble. Emily, do you know who you're speaking to? A pause, just long enough to matter. Yes, she said. And then nothing else, no apology, no adjustment, just silence that refused to bend. And for the first time that evening, something shifted, not in the room, not in the staff, but in him, because power had always been easy when people played along, and this time someone didn't, and he hadn't even started the game yet. Power does not speak loudly at first, it tests quietly, and Richard Blackwood had just begun. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to, he simply glanced at the menu, then set it down, as if it disappointed him. Bring me something worth my time, he said, eyes still on Emily, not the words, but the weight behind them, a familiar trap. Most people rushed to impress, filled the silence with apologies or suggestions. She did neither. She stood still, pen ready, waiting for something real to respond to. The seconds stretched, the room tightened around them. Even the bartender slowed his movements just to listen. Richard tilted his head, slightly changing tactics. Fine, he said, I will make it simple, a 12-ounce ribeye, medium rare. But if it is not perfect, I will send it back, and you will bring another until it is, or until your manager decides you are not worth the trouble. A faint smile touched his lips. There it was, the game terms, control, consequence. Emily nodded once. Clear, calm, understood. She said nothing more, no defensive tone, no attempt to soften him, just acknowledgement. And then she turned to place the order, her steps measured, unhurried, as if the pressure had not followed her into the kitchen. Behind the doors, whispers immediately rose. That is his table, someone muttered. He will send it back, no matter what. Another added. The manager hovered near the pass, watching the clock, like it was ticking louder than usual, but Emily simply stood beside the chef, repeating the order once with precision, and when the plate came out, she checked it quietly, not like someone afraid of being blamed, but like someone who respected the work itself. When she returned, Richard had not moved, his posture exactly the same, as if he had been carved into the chair. She placed the plate down gently. Your ribeye, medium rare, she said. He did not touch it right away. Instead, he looked at her again, searching for something, a crack, a hesitation, anything that suggested she understood the rules and would eventually bend. Then slowly he picked up the knife, cut through the steak. The room held its breath again. He took a bite, chewed once, twice, his expression unreadable, and then he set the fork down. It is acceptable, he said, the words landing flat, almost disappointing, because there was no victory in them, no reaction to feed on. He leaned back, studying her more closely. Now most people would have exhaled, relieved, smiled, thanked him. She did not. She simply asked, is there anything else you need? And that was when something subtle shifted, not in the room, not even in the tension, but in the rhythm of the exchange, because for the first time Richard realized he was the one being measured, not by skill, not by service, but by something far less familiar, something he could not, by something that did not react to pressure. And he found himself leaning forward just slightly, as if trying to understand a language no one had ever spoken to him before. Respect is quiet, but so is control, and Richard Blackwood had just realized he no longer had either. He tapped the table once slow, deliberate, a signal not for service, but for attention, and across the room the manager immediately started moving toward them, but Richard lifted a single finger stopping him without looking away from Emily. "No," he said softly. "She stays." The manager froze mid-step, confusion flickering before retreating, because when Richard Blackwood made a decision, people followed it, even when they did not understand it. Emily did not move either. She simply stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, not waiting, not reacting, just present. Richard studied her longer this time, not like a customer judging service, but like a man trying to find the edge of something he could not quite define. "Most people shift under silence," he said finally. "They start explaining themselves, filling the air, trying to fix what they think is wrong. You do not." Emily met his gaze evenly. "There is nothing wrong," she replied. And again, no extra words, no attempt to soften the statement, just truth placed gently, but firmly between them. A few nearby diners pretended not to listen, but their eyes betrayed them. This was no longer about a meal. It was something else, something slower, something sharper. Richard leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. "Tell me, Emily," he said, voice lower, now almost conversational. "What do you think I am doing here?" It was not a question he usually asked. It was a trap disguised as curiosity. Most answered with flattery or caution. She did neither. "You are looking for a reaction," she said, and the words landed clean, not accusatory, not afraid, just precise. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "Go on," he said. She took a small breath, not to steady herself, but to choose her words carefully. "You create pressure," she continued. "You change the rules. You wait to see who bends first. And when they do, you decide what they are worth." The room went completely still. Even the soft music seemed to fade into the background. Richard did not interrupt. He did not smile either, because for the first time someone had described the game while he was still playing it. And that was something new, something unfamiliar, something he could not immediately control. "And what if they do not bend?" he asked quietly. Emily held his gaze. "Then they are not part of your game," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument. Richard leaned back slowly, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the table, not impatient, not dismissive, but thoughtful, the kind of pause that did not happen often around him. "You speak like someone who has seen this before," he said. Emily's expression did not change. "People are not that different," she replied. "Some just have more expensive ways of asking the same questions." A faint shift moved through the room, not laughter, not shock, something quieter, something closer to realization, and Richard felt it. The shift in balance, the subtle moment where the room was no longer reacting to him alone. He glanced down at his untouched glass of water, then back at her, and for a brief second something almost unfamiliar crossed his face. Not anger, not amusement, something closer to respect. But he did not acknowledge it, not yet. Instead, he reached for his wallet, slowly, deliberately placing it on the table, not opening it, just setting it there like a reminder, like a test, like a final move, waiting to see if she would finally play along. Money only works when the other person wants it, and Richard Blackwood knew that, which was why he did not open the wallet right away. He let it sit there, heavy, intentional, a quiet offer disguised as control. Most people would have glanced at it, at least just a flicker of curiosity, just enough for him to know where the line was. Emily did not. Her eyes never dropped, not once. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, not tense, not uncertain, something steadier, something that did not move for him. "You know what this means," he said, lightly tapping the edge of the wallet with one finger, his tone casual but measured, as if he were explaining something obvious to someone who had simply not learned it. Yet Emily's voice came just as calm. "I know what you think it means," she said, and that was enough to shift the air again, because she had not asked, she had not waited, she had answered the question behind the words. Richard leaned back slightly, a faint smile forming, not mocking, not warm, something in between. "Then tell me," he said. "What do I think it means?" Emily glanced at the wallet briefly, not drawn to it, just acknowledging its presence like any other object in the room. Then she looked back at him. "You think it ends the conversation," she said. "You think it decides how this moment is remembered." And for the first time that evening, there was a pause that did not belong to him. It lingered just long enough to be felt across the room. Richard's fingers stilled against the leather surface. He studied her again, but differently, now not searching for weakness, but measuring something else, something quieter, more difficult to name. "And what does it mean to you?" he asked, his voice lower than before, almost stripped of its earlier certainty. Emily's answer came without hesitation. "It means nothing if it is trying to replace respect," she said simply. "I will bring you what you order. I will treat you the same as anyone else. But I will not be priced into reacting the way you expect." A soft shift moved through the nearby tables. A breath released somewhere, a glass set down more carefully, Then before no one spoke, but everyone felt it, the line drawn, without noise, without force, just there, an undeniable. Richard let out a slow breath, almost a quiet laugh, but without humor. Interesting, he murmured, more to himself than to her. His hand moved at last, opening the wallet just enough to reveal the edge of a card, then closing it again, not withdrawn, not offered, just reconsidered. He looked at her once more, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a question he had not prepared for. "You are new here," he said, "and it was not really a question." Emily nodded slightly. "First week. And yet you are not trying to keep this job at all costs," he observed. She held his gaze. "I am," she said, "just not at the cost you are offering." Another pause, deeper this time, because that was the part he was not used to, the part where someone understood the trade and declined it clearly, calmly, without anger, without fear. Richard's eyes flickered for a moment toward the rest of the room, the staff pretending to work, the diners pretending not to watch, and then back to her, and something shifted again, smaller, but real, not a collapse, not yet, but a crack in the rhythm he had always relied on. He closed the wallet fully, this time sliding it back toward himself without comment, and for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, the power in the room did not feel like his alone. Control rarely disappears all at once. It fades in moments so small most people miss them, and Richard Blackwood felt the first real shift, not in the room, but in himself. He reached for his glass this time, not as a gesture, not as a signal, just a simple movement, and took a slow sip, as if grounding himself in something that did not respond back. Emily remained where she was, not hovering, not retreating, just present enough to matter and distant enough not to be pulled into anything more. The balance had changed, and they both knew it, even if neither of them said it aloud. "You are different," he said finally, not as a judgment, not even as curiosity, more like a conclusion. Emily tilted her head slightly. "Everyone is," she replied. "It just depends on what you are looking for." A faint exhale left him, almost a quiet acknowledgement, because for once the conversation was not something he could steer with money or pressure. It moved on its own pace, and he was no longer ahead of it. He glanced around, briefly noticing something he had not paid attention to before. The way the staff were no longer avoiding the table entirely. They were still cautious, still aware, but not frozen, not dictated by him alone. The room had begun to breathe again, and that was new. That was not how it usually worked. He looked back at Emily, and for a brief moment something softer crossed his expression, not weakness, not surrender, just recognition. "You have done this before," he said, more certain now than questioning. Emily shook her head slightly. "No," she said, "just once, every time someone forgets they're speaking to a person." The words were simple, but they settled deeper than anything else that had been said that evening. Richard leaned back again, but this time it was not to create distance, it was to think, and thinking was not something he allowed often in moments like this. Usually, he decided, he concluded, he moved on, but now there was a pause that did not belong to strategy, it belonged to understanding, and that was unfamiliar. He let his fingers rest against the table, not tapping, not signaling, just still. Then he asked something no one in that room had ever heard him ask before, not like this. "What do you get out of this?" he said, his voice quieter than it had been all night. Emily did not answer right away. She looked at the table, the plate, the glass, the small details that made up the moment, and then back at him. "I get to leave at the end of the night knowing I did not have to become someone else just to get through it," she said, and there was no pride in it, no performance, just truth, and that was the part that stayed in the air long after the words were spoken. Because it was not something he could measure, not something he could offer more of or take away, it simply existed outside of him. Richard nodded once slowly, not agreement, not defeat, just acknowledgement of something he could not rewrite, and as Emily turned slightly to step back into the rhythm of the restaurant, not rushing, not lingering, he realized something he had not expected when he walked in. He had not won anything tonight, and strangely, he had not lost either, but for the first time in a very long time he had been forced to see the difference. Some moments do not end. When they are over, they echo quietly in the way people move afterward, and as Emily stepped away from the table, the rhythm of the restaurant resumed, but not in the same way. Conversations returned, softer, more aware. The staff moved with a little less hesitation, as if something unspoken had been lifted. Richard Blackwood remained seated, but he was no longer the center of gravity. He was simply a man at a table with a cooling plate and a mind that had not yet settled. He watched her without calling her back, not out of control this time, but out of choice, because for the first time he was not sure what calling her back would even mean. The usual patterns did not apply, the usual outcomes did not exist. He let that sit with him, a rare stillness in a life that rarely paused. Minutes passed, not many, but enough for the moment to stretch into something reflective. he noticed small things now: the way the light shifted across the glass, the quiet coordination between servers, the subtle confidence. Returning to the room, details he had always overlooked, because they had never required his attention before, but now they did, because for once he was not directing anything, he was observing it. Emily moved through her section with the same calm precision as before, no glance back, no sign that anything unusual had happened, and that unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because it meant the moment had not defined her, it had not even changed her, it had simply revealed her, and that realization lingered longer than expected. He reached for his wallet again, slower this time, not as a tool, not as a test, just as a habit, but his hand paused halfway there, and then rested back on the table, untouched, the gesture unfinished, because something in him no longer needed to complete it. When Emily returned, it was not to him at first. She checked another table, adjusted a glass, offered a quiet smile, and then finally stepped back into his space, not drawn by him, but by the natural flow of her work. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" she asked, and her voice was exactly the same as before, steady, neutral, present. Richard looked up at her, and for a moment the answer he almost gave felt unfamiliar, because it did not come from habit, it came from thought. "No," he said simply, and the word carried no edge, no expectation, just truth. He paused, then added, "Thank you." And it was not performative, it was not calculated, it was small and real, and that was new. Emily nodded, once not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging it as part of the exchange. She cleared the plate with the same care she had shown before and turned to leave, but Richard spoke again, not louder, just enough to stop the moment. "Emily." She turned back. "Yes, sir." Another pause, shorter this time, but just as deliberate. "What made you stay like that earlier?" he asked, not demanding, not testing, just asking. Emily considered the question for a second, not searching for an answer, but deciding which one mattered most. "Because leaving would have been easier," she said quietly, and then she stepped away before he could respond. The words remained with him longer than anything else that night, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just clear. And as he sat there in a room that no longer revolved around him, Richard Blackwood understood something simple and unfamiliar. Staying had not been about resisting him, it had been about refusing to leave herself behind. Change does not arrive with noise, it settles in quietly, and stays long after the moment has passed. And as the evening moved forward, Richard Blackwood found himself doing something unfamiliar. He stayed longer than he needed to, not out of obligation, not out of strategy, but because leaving now would have meant returning to something unchanged, and for the first time that felt incomplete. He watched the room again, not as a space he controlled, but as something that existed without him. Conversations flowed naturally, glasses were refilled without hesitation, laughter returned in small waves, and somewhere between all of it, Emily moved exactly the same as before, not faster, not slower, not aware of being watched. And that consistency stayed with him more than anything else, because it meant she had not been performing, she had simply been herself, and that was something he could not replicate. He finally reached for the check when it arrived, not with urgency, but with intention. His eyes scanned the total briefly, an amount that meant nothing in the scale of his world, and yet the moment felt different, heavier, not because of the number, but because of what it represented. He took out his card, paused for just a second, and then set it down without the usual emphasis, without the silent expectation that came with it. When Emily returned, she picked up the check holder with the same steady movement, no glance at the amount, no shift in expression, just part of the process. And that small detail held more weight than he expected, because it confirmed something he had been slowly realizing all evening. This interaction had never been about money at all. When she brought the receipt back, he signed it quickly, but when it came to the tip, his pen stopped hovering above the line, not because he did not know what to write, but because for once the number did not feel like the point. He wrote it anyway, a large amount, more than generous by any standard, but the motion lacked its usual certainty, because it no longer carried the same meaning. He closed the folder and slid it forward slightly, not as a statement, just as completion. Emily returned moments later, collected it with a quiet thank you, and turned to leave. But he spoke again, not to stop her, not to test her, just to finish something he had not expected to begin earlier. "You were right," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried something new. Emily paused, just enough to acknowledge it, then faced him. "What part?" she asked, and her tone held no assumption, no expectation. Richard met her eyes, and for the first time, there was no calculation behind it. "This does not decide how the moment is remembered," he said, and the honesty in it was not loud, but it was clear. Emily gave a small nod, not approval, not surprise, just recognition. Then she said, "Good," and turned away, leaving the word to settle on its own. And as Richard sat there a moment longer before standing, he realized something that did not come with discomfort or regret, just clarity. Nothing about this evening had gone the way he intended, and yet it felt more complete than any carefully controlled outcome he had ever created, because for once the result had not been something he forced, it had been something he understood. Leaving is easy when nothing has changed, but when something shifts even slightly, the exit feels different. And as Richard Blackwood stood from the table, the chair moved back with a soft sound that did not command attention the way it usually did. No one turned immediately. No one paused their conversations. The room continued as it had been, and that alone told him everything he needed to know. He adjusted his jacket out of habit, not necessity, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if he were stepping out of something rather than away from it. And for a brief moment he remained there, standing beside the table, not because he had forgotten something, but because there was nothing left to control. The absence of that feeling was unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, just new. He glanced once more across the dining room, not searching, not evaluating, simply observing the way people existed without reacting to him. And it did not feel like a loss, it felt like clarity. Near the service station, Emily placed the check folder down, without opening it, moving on to the next task. With the same quiet efficiency she had shown all evening, the number inside meant nothing to her, not because it lacked value, but because it did not define anything that had happened, and that distinction remained invisible to most, but not to him anymore. He took a step forward, then another, not toward her, not away from her, just toward the door, each movement unhurried, unannounced. And as he reached the front of the restaurant, the host looked up instinctively, offering a polite nod, not the careful deference from earlier, just simple acknowledgement. "Good night, sir," she said, and he returned it with a slight nod of his own. No extra weight, no expectation, just equal exchange. The door opened with a soft push, the cool night air meeting him without hesitation, and for the first time that evening there was nothing waiting on the other side. No plan, no continuation, no need to reclaim anything. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, the city moving as it always did, cars passing, lights shifting, people walking by without noticing him, and it felt different, not smaller, not less important, just real. He paused for a moment, looking back through the glass, not searching for her, but aware of where she was inside, still moving, still working, still exactly the same as when he had first seen her, and that consistency held something he had not expected to find. Respect, not given, not taken, just recognized. He turned away, then adjusting his pace to the rhythm of the street, no longer ahead of it, no longer trying to direct it, and somewhere behind him the restaurant continued exactly as it should without him. And for once, that did not feel like something to change, it felt like something to understand. The lesson of a moment is rarely understood. When it happens, it reveals itself later in the quiet spaces where no one is watching. And as Richard Blackwood walked down the street, the city lights reflecting off glass and steel, he found his mind returning not to the meal, not to the service, but to something far simpler. The way she had stood still, the way she had not reacted, the way she had remained entirely herself in a space designed to make people adjust. And that stayed with him longer than any deal, any negotiation, any carefully controlled outcome. He had built his life on knowing how people would respond, on predicting pressure points, on shaping conversations before they even began. But tonight had not followed that pattern, and the absence of control had not created chaos, it had created clarity. He slowed his pace slightly, hands in his coat pockets, not in thought as much as in recognition, because for the first time in a long time, he had not been the most certain person in the room, and instead of breaking the moment, it had defined it behind him inside the restaurant. Emily continued her shift the same way she had started it, steady, focused, present. She cleared tables, refilled glasses, answered quiet questions. Nothing about her movements suggested that anything unusual had taken place, because to her it had not. It had simply been another moment where someone expected her to change, and she had not, and that was enough. When her shift finally ended hours later, she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it in her locker. The same routine, the same rhythm, no added weight, no lingering thought about the man who had sat at table 12, because the night had not been about him, it had been about her choice to remain unchanged. She stepped outside into the cool air, the city quieter, now the streets less crowded, the noise softened into something distant and manageable. She walked without urgency, her pace matching the world around her, not ahead of it, not behind it, just within it. And somewhere across the city, Richard paused at a crosswalk, the light shifting from red to green, and for a brief moment, he did not move, not because he was distracted, but because he was aware of something that had not been there before, the realization that power had never really been about how many people responded to him, but about whether he needed them to. And as he stepped forward with the crowd, not leading, not directing, just moving, he understood something simple, something that did not need to be spoken aloud. The strongest presence in the room had not been the one who controlled it, had been the one who did not need to.